Okay, now we're moving on to sewing on buttons. So we just did the buttons and holes. Now we're gonna move on to sewing different types of buttons on in different ways. So right now we have 3 buttons to sew on. One has 4 holes, one has 2 holes, and then the other one, I'm gonna grab this clear one here. This one has 2 holes, and we're going to create a shank under one of these. So a shank is, if you guys look at the module, it's when a button has a raised portion underneath. So we'll kind of draw a picture of a button with a shank right here. If you have a button, let's say, I don't know, maybe it's like a pearl shaped button, and underneath it, it has like a little loop, kind of like a little mushroom. That part is the shank. So sometimes you'll see them square, so sometimes maybe it looks like this, and then maybe you have like a flower button on top. But this portion down here, this is called the shank. And this is, again, so go through the module because it talks in detail about the shank. This is so that your fabric can have some space in between the bottom of the button and the fabric that it's connected to. This little bit of space, this little gap between the button and the fabric allows your other side of your buttonhole to lay underneath here with some room. I use the example in the module of like a pea coat. If you have a pea coat that's really thick wool with thick interfacing and maybe some like batting in there, if you want to put, let's say, this button on there, if you go to button this through, you know, fabric that's a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch thick, it's going to kind of pull and it's going to kind of like pucker and pull down on the fabric. That's not good. It makes it look like your buttons are too tight, or maybe that your garment's too tight, but it's actually not. It's just the fact that the button is sitting too close to the fabric, and so it makes it look a little like bulky and like it's pulling. If you add a thread shank underneath it, so if you were to add thread underneath this to give it that needed space, then it's able to sit flat on top of the fabric and not look like it's pulling. So that's what we're gonna do. We don't have a built-in shank to these buttons, so we're gonna make a shank out of thread. So what I want to do is I want to show you how to sew on one button, just normal. So we're just going to show you how to sew that on by hand. One button by hand with the shank. And then I'm going to sew on another button by machine. So that's kind of a really cool one. So I'm just going to start with this one here. Well, actually, let me start with the 4 for sewing on a regular old button. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a hand needle. You can kind of choose what you like size-wise. And again, no more than about 18 inches of thread. So I'm gonna go ahead and take about 18 inches of thread, and I'm going to tie them together on the end. That's my seam gauge. So I'm gonna tie a double knot because I wanna make sure it stays put. I might even do a triple knot just in case, just because I usually do 3. Okay, so I've got my knot, and I'm gonna cut the threads nice and short. Get those out of there. Leave about, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch. And then I have my beeswax, and I'm just going to take my thread and I'm just going to run it through my beeswax, just one quick little run through. So now I have 18 inches of thread on my hand needle. So when you sew a button on, the first thing you want to do is you want to hide your knot. So I want to place my button here, and again, normally there would be an X shape. There would be like an X like this where you would be sewing your buttons on. So I'm going to find my X, I'm going to take my knot, I'm going to hide it on the top. Yeah, I'm gonna hide my knot on the fabric on the pretty side because the button will sit on top. So that's kind of a little trick. When your buttons fall off, the button doesn't break, the thread usually doesn't snap, but the knot comes untied or the knot comes snagged, and so that's what comes undone. So if you hide the knot, it's a little bit safer. So I like to hide the knot under the button, and then I go ahead and I needle stitch through one of the eyes, one of the holes, and then I go through the other one directly across. When it comes to the way that you're going to kind of stitch through the holes of a button, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. So let me go to the back of this buttonhole here and kind of draw. If you have 4 holes, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can go up, across, down, and over. That's fine, you can do that. You can also do, there you go, sorry. Oh, maybe not. Let me use my scissors. Sorry, guys. There you go. You could also do an X if you want it. That's fine. You could also do across and across. You can also do down and up. You could do over, across, box, check. You can kind of do whatever you want. Once you have 2 of them, that's enough for safety. So I'm just gonna go ahead and go across and across, top and then bottom. So that's the way I'm just gonna do it. And really this is all just kind of taste. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. So I'm gonna take mine and I'm gonna go across and I'm just kind of looping. Excuse me. Sorry. One thing that I like to do too, when I'm using a hand needle, when I'm sewing my buttons on, I like to make it as clean as possible. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go through 1, 2 thicknesses, but I'm not gonna go all the way to the very, very last thickness, the last piece of fabric, because what I want is I want for a really pretty, really clean back of my sample. This would be, let's say it's a button-up shirt. Maybe on the inside of my button-up shirt, I don't want to see a bunch of tied knots all messy and whatnot. So I'm just gonna hide it. And so that's something you can do if you feel, you know, comfortable doing that, not going through all layers. And so I'm gonna come through, back from the right, over the left. And again, I'm not going through all layers. So then I'm going to, I'm just making a little sample with some hand sewn buttons. I'm gonna go through maybe 1, 2 layers, but not all 3, and then I'm gonna come back again. And you're gonna do this about, I don't know, 6 times. I'm gonna cheat, and I'm gonna, don't do as I do, do as I say. And I'm gonna come back through 1 more time, and that's it. So make sure that you're doing it about 6, maybe 8 times, you know, just depending on how tight and firm it is. And then what I'm gonna do on this next one is I'm gonna move on to my next hole. So again, make sure that you're doing all of them. Don't do as I say, or do as I say, not as I do. And then I'm gonna come back. And then again, I don't wanna go through all layers, so I'm gonna skip a couple and I'm gonna just go through the fabric. And one of the cool things about doing it by hand, because I know that this is black and it's kind of hard to see, but you don't see any thread that crosses. It's just straight horizontal, and then you'll have some straight horizontal threads. You don't have to worry about having like a diagonal thread that comes across. And that happens when you sew a button on by machine. So I'll just kind of draw you a picture of it. If you have a machine sewn button, you'll see something like this where you have stitches, stitches, and then you'll see like a really thin single thread that comes across the top. And that's because of the machine, because you don't stop in between your stitches. So I like doing it by hand if I want my buttons to look really clean, or if I want to do, you know, something special with the stitch. So again, I'm coming in, I'm coming out. Make sure to do it about 6 times, maybe 8. And then when you're done, so again, do more than what I just did. When you're done, come through, so come down into one of the holes so that your thread is sitting under the button but on top of the fabric. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie a knot underneath the button. Even if you're going all the way through the fabric, still come back so that your thread is sitting under the button but on top of the fabric, and grab just a little bit of fabric, couple, you know, yarns, and then use this loop that's being made to pull your knot through. And then tie that off. Oh, and I kind of knotted mine a little bit. And then what you can do is you can stick your needle through your fabric to draw it to the back, and then you can clip your threads there. And then it kind of sucks it into the material anyways. So that's just sewing a button on by hand. That's just kind of a normal button sewn on by hand. And so what I want to do now is I want to show you how to sew a button on with a shank, so with a thread shank. So this isn't enough thread, so I'm going to toss that to the side, and I'm going to get another 18 inches of thread out, and I'm going to cut that. And again, I'm going to thread the eye of the needle, and let's see if I can make it nice clean end here. Again, with closures, you're always going to want to do double thickness. So you'll see in the next video, sewing on a hook and eye. And that one, it's really important that you have double thickness. So I'll talk about hook and eyes after this. And just remember that with closures, you always want double thickness because it needs to stay put. It needs to be really strong. It's there for strength and support. Okay, so I'm gonna do a double knot, triple knot if you want. Cut those really short. Oops, sorry, cut those really short. And then I'm gonna prepare for my next button that I'm gonna sew on. And I'm gonna use this clear one and I'm gonna sew this one on with the shank. So I'm gonna start the same way. I'm gonna hide my knot on my X on the top, on the pretty side of the fabric. And what I want to do is, I wanna use maybe a toothpick, a pin, maybe you wanna use like a hand needle, something. You're gonna place something like a toothpick or a pin underneath your button. And then you're gonna lay your button on top. And what you're attempting to do is you're just trying to raise the button off the fabric a little bit. So I'm gonna put that pin under there and I'm gonna start sewing this on. And this one I wanna try as best as I can to not go through all 3 layers. So my first one's gonna be kind of hard because I gotta kind of hold on to everything. But I'm gonna loop under, keeping it as clean as I can. Pulling across. And I'm gonna put that pin under there before I let go. Put the pin right here. Okay, and go ahead and pull that taut. Okay, once you get your first thread through, the first stitch, that'll make it a lot easier to do the rest of these. So now I'm gonna come through. And what you wanna make sure when you're doing your button with the shank is you just want to make sure that you're not pulling super, super, super tight. The purpose of the toothpick or the pin sitting underneath the button is so that you can kind of see that it's kind of hovering. So it's kind of like floating above the fabric here. So if I do that, you guys can kind of see there's a little bit of space in there. That's the whole point of putting this pin there. You want to make sure that the button is not sitting flat on the fabric as you stitch it. So you're trying to give yourself a little space. So don't pull too taut. You don't want to do that because then you defeat the purpose. And again, you're gonna do this about 6 to 8 times depending, but I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna stop short just because it's a demo. And then once you've done your 6 or 8 stitches, you're gonna let go of the needle. You're going to pull your toothpick or your pin out of the fabric, away from the thread. And you're gonna notice that the button sits kind of on top. Again, you can kind of wiggle it so it's sitting on top of the fabric. Now what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your thread and your needle and you're gonna start to wrap underneath, and you're just gonna wrap around and around and around a good, I don't know, 10, 15 times. And what you're attempting to do is you're trying to make a thread shank. So if I take this now and turn it sideways for you, do you see how now this button is not sitting flat on the fabric? It's got a good, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch of space below it. That is now your thread shank. So to finish this off pretty easily, I'm just gonna lift up the button like I did before. I'm gonna grab a hair, just a thread or 2 from underneath the button. And then I'm gonna use that loop to make a knot, and I'm gonna tie that off. And I'm gonna do this one a double knot just in case. Just because I want it to stay put. Again, using that loop and tying off your knot. And I like to finish this the same way where I stab through the fabric, pull my threads under, and then cut my thread short back here. That way that the material can kind of suck the threads in. And now you see, flat button. And if you look at it from the side, the black button has nothing underneath it. There's no space. But you can see now under the yellow button that there's plenty of space underneath there. So if I wanted to use this on thicker material, I can. Okay, now the last one I want to do is I want to sew the last one on by machine. So I'm going to take this big guy, so hopefully it's easier to see. I'm going to place him on top of the X, and I'm going to sew this on by machine. So let me pull this over so you can kind of see the settings on my machine. I was just doing a buttonhole, so it's set up for that. So I'm going to clear. I'm going to power on, power off. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this prepared for sewing my button on, not a buttonhole. So what I want to do is I want to make sure I'm on a straight stitch. And I want to take my width to anywhere between a 2 and a 3. So I'm going to go 2.5 with my width. So about 2.5 there. And I'm going to take my length to 0, to nothing. So my length is now nothing, which means that instead of my needle moving up and down, it's just gonna stand still and it's gonna go nowhere. But I gave it width. So it is gonna go side to side, which means it's going to go side to side in between the holes, doom, 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 but it's not gonna go anywhere else. It's not gonna move up or down and then stab into the button, break the needle. It's only gonna go side to side. And to make sure that it doesn't move up or down, I'm gonna come and put my hand on the right side of the machine over here, and I'm gonna turn my feed dogs off. If you have a feed dog lever that turns your feed dogs off, I would highly suggest using it. So if you look down here at my feed dogs now, you'll see that they're down. I don't feel those little serrated teeth anymore. They're gone. That means that I'm ready to go. That means that I'm ready to sew a button by machine. So let me go ahead and get you all set up. I'm gonna move this over. Let me get this down here. And I'm gonna go ahead and place my button on the X of my material. And I'm gonna go side to side like I did by hand. So I'm gonna do that by machine. I'm just getting my machine threaded up real quickly. And okay, so now that I'm all threaded, I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna set it underneath my 3 foot. So I'm gonna keep that 3 foot on that I use for my buttonhole because it has a big opening. And that's really nice because now, and I know it's a little dark and a little hard to see, now when I put my foot down, I can see the holes much better than I would be able to if I was using a 0 or 1 foot. So hopefully, I know it's a little hard to see, but hopefully you can see. And let me see if I can get this off of here to show you a little bit better. So if you can see in there, because it's a big opening, you can see the holes. Okay? What I like to do to start, I always want to hold my threads down, so I'm definitely going to hold my threads down to start. But I also want to make sure that I'm hand willing. So I'm going to bring this down here. And again, I'm going to hold my threads back. Abby, will you hold my threads over here for me? Come on over here on the side of the machine.
Okay.
Other side. Thank you. I'm one-handing it here. So I want you to take this hand and I want you to hold these threads just like that. Don't let them go, okay? So we're gonna have Abby hold the threads now. Hold them down tight. And then I'll tell you when you can let go, okay? Okay, they're gonna wiggle around. I'm gonna take my hand wheel and I'm gonna rotate down, making sure that I'm not hitting the button and I'm kind of touching it. So I'm gonna move my button over just a smidge, just the tiniest little bit over. And I'm gonna set that back down. And I'm gonna hand wheel still, so hold on to that thread still, Abs. Okay, and I'm gonna jump over. And I don't know if you guys can see it or not. Now you can let go, Abby. You can let go of the threads, thank you. It's kind of hard to see, but I'm gonna hit the button. So what I wanna do is I wanna just lift up real quickly, make my width of my zigzag a little bit bigger. So I was at 2.5. Now I'm gonna crank it to like, I don't know, 2 3/4, just a little bit bigger. And then I'm just gonna prepare my button by moving it over just a tad. I'm gonna hand wheel down. Now I'm gonna hand wheel back to the left and make sure that I'm landing in a hole, which I am. And now that I know that I'm gonna land in holes and I'm not gonna break a button, now I can go ahead and step on the pedal. So I'm gonna go ahead and step, and I'm going side to side. And you're gonna do this again like 6 to 8 times until it's nice and tight. Now that I've done my side to side stitches and there's only 2 holes in this, I need to tie a knot. And instead of taking it out and having to tie a knot by hand, what I can do now is I can come to my settings, I can take my length still to 0, and I'm gonna take my width to 0 also. So I'm at nothing right now. What that does is that puts my needle right smack dab in the middle of the button, which if I go ahead and hand wheel down, it's gonna break, it's gonna hit the plastic. So what I wanna do is I wanna move my button over just a smidge so that I'm in one of the holes. And then I'm gonna hand wheel down to make sure I'm in there. And now that I know I'm in, I'm gonna step on the pedal, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4 times to tie a knot. And then I can lift this, pull my button away, and you can see that now I have a really nice sewn button by machine. So I'm gonna cut these threads short, cut that short, so I'm one-handing it now. And I'm gonna trim these the same way I did with the ones that were sewn by hand. I'm gonna cut these ones short on the top, and then I'm going to tug on them from the back. And there you now have your sewn by hand sewn with the shank, and then sewn by machine. And then if you could just take a picture of the fronts of your samples and then of the back, you guys won't have writing on yours obviously. And then with your buttons, take a picture of the front of your sample and then the back. And then when you get to your hook and eye, I'll talk about the hook and eye now, and then you'll see there's a video on how to sew it from YouTube. What I do is I just take a simple 3x6 piece of sample fabric and I just fold it into quarters so that I have this nice little small piece of fabric. And what I'm attempting to do is I'm trying to get like a finished edge, because the hook and eye is the last thing that you're gonna sew on. And so what happens with the hook and an eye is that the hook and eye usually goes above a zipper, and it always goes above an invisible zipper, because an invisible zipper is something that needs a hook and eye. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna wanna make it so that the fabric is flush touching, no gaps, and no overlaps. So you'll see in the next video, in the next module, that hook and eyes should lie pretty flush, so there's not any overlap in space. Hook and eyes are really strong. They're the strongest of the samples, so you want to make sure that you sew it on correctly, making sure that when you're I'm going to draw. Abby, can I have that pink marker? Thank you. Making sure that when you have your eye, which looks something like this, there's circles, circles, and a circle, that you're gonna loop all the way around each of the smaller circles. And then this is the eye that it catches onto, so this is the part that it catches. And then for your hook, which looks kind of like this, and it has a circle and a circle, you're gonna wanna do the same thing. You're gonna wanna go all the way around the circles and around the neck of the eye. So you'll see in the video that your hook and then your eye, you need to make sure that you sew across correctly. Okay.